had to reduce his hours as he sold after 9 p.m. Monday through Saturday. On those days, the state...
But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home.
Of confidence.
Introduction. The Democratic Carter administration saw marvelous success in areas of human rights and job building. However, there were many issues that began to surface during his presidency that he summed up as a crisis of confidence. The American people had a lack of confidence in themselves and the government, according to Carter, and this was causing the nation to suffer. Reagan, running against Carter as the Republican presidential candidate in 1981, agreed that there was an issue of confidence. However, he differed in where it resided. The lack of confidence resided in the government alone. According to Reagan, the government was too large and was constantly failing the American people. If the government wanted the respect and confidence of the American people, the government would need to fix the issues within themselves. An influential question posed by Reagan during his campaign for president was whether the American people thought the next 4 years would be better than the prior 4. This question was answered with the landslide victory of Reagan in 1981. The Carter administration. James Carter had a consistent value for human and civil rights all throughout his political career, and this is one of the values he relied on during his 1976 campaign for president. During his first presidential debate with President Gerald Ford, Carter offered a great acknowledgement to the need for human and civil rights. He also offered a plan to help fix the declining economic situation during the 1970s, and offered a plan to remedy the energy crisis facing America.
Mandatory conservation measures, yes. Encouragement by the president for people to voluntarily conserve, yes. And also the private sector ought to be encouraged to bring forward to the public the benefits from efficiency. One bank in Washington, for instance, gives lower interest loans for people who adequately insulate their homes or who buy efficient automobiles. And some major manufacturing companies like Dow Chemical have, through very effective efficiency mechanisms, cut down the use of energy by as much as 40% with the same out product. These kinds of things ought to be done. They ought to be encouraged and supported, and even required by the government, yes.
President Ford? Governor Carter skims over a very serious and a very broad subject.
Ford did have some valid criticisms of Carter's plans, most importantly the observation of how vague some of the plans were. This observation by Ford would foreshadow the major issues of Carter's presidency. Although it is generally agreed that Ford was the winner of the first debate, the following 2 debates were won by Carter. As mentioned, the Carter administration had success in fields of human rights, creating jobs, success in aiding the economy, and starting a point for the energy crisis with the National Energy Act. Also having success in other liberal fields such as healthcare and conservation. However, his efforts to reduce the record-high inflation caused a recession in the nation, which influenced the rise in crime and violence within the country. The lack of confidence during the Carter administration. The Bureau of Justice Statistics graphs the crime rate trends in America post-World War II, and the documents show that the 70s began a record-breaking peak trend in crime. And that's the graph you see on screen now. The rise in crime seemed to appear from nowhere during Carter's administration. However, with hindsight, the issues were plainly inevitable. One considered factor was the longevity of the economic issues facing America. Typically, a downward trend in the economy is contrasted by an upward trend in crime. Also, ironically, during Carter's administration, civil rights movements such as the Black Power movement began to reject the nonviolent civil protests with militant self-preservation ideals due to the discontent of civil progress under the Carter administration. Later in his presidency, it became evident that Carter took this unprecedented rise in crime and violence personally by the way that he addressed this issue to the nation. Considering the rise in crime, the violent approaches, the recession, and the unpopular handling of the Iranian hostage situation, the American people have plenty of reasons to be discontent and lacking confidence in the American government. Carter, seeming to take the issues personally, addressed the issue in his crisis of confidence speech, which is also known as the Melee speech.
In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. The symptoms of this crisis of the American spirit are all around us. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5 years. 2/3 of our people do not even vote. The productivity of American workers is actually dropping, and the willingness of Americans to save for the future has fallen below that of all other people in the Western world. As you know, there is a growing disrespect for government and for churches and for schools, the news media, and other institutions. This is not a message of happiness or reassurance, but it is the truth. And it is a warning. These changes did not happen overnight. They've come upon us gradually over the last generation. Years that were filled with shocks and tragedy. We were sure that ours was a nation of the ballot, not the bullet, until the murders of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. We were taught that our armies were always invincible and our causes were always just, only to suffer the agony of Vietnam. We respected the presidency as a place of honor until the shock of Watergate. We remember when the phrase "sound as a dollar" was an expression of absolute dependability.
The inspiration for this speech came from the discussions he had with American people during his stay at his presidential retreat. Here the people voiced their concerns about the state of America. One of his guests mentioned how there was a moral and spiritual crisis facing America. During this speech, President Carter addresses a plethora of administrative changes, such as replacing the ill-qualified people who failed to perform their jobs. But the most striking topic was the confidence of the American people. In this speech, Carter shifts blame for the issues facing the government and their performances, primarily on the confidence of the American people. He acknowledges that there was room for improvement within the government, but with the American people blatantly disrespecting and abusing the government, completing services to the people efficiently have become difficult. One of the quotes was, "It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul of our national will." We can see this crisis in the growing doubt of the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of unity and purpose as a nation. The erosion of confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and political fabric of the nation. In this speech, Carter also points out that the people of America should grow new faith in their government and one another. He mentions how their lack of confidence is becoming evident in work quality, lack of motivation to find work, lack of motivation to save for the future, and a rise in crime. He also mentions the Cadell polls, which surveyed that Americans are expecting the next 5 years to be worse than the previous 5 years. This is a point Reagan takes advantage of during his campaign for presidency. This speech wasn't received well by the American people. The Presidency Project shows the approval rating for Carter dropped even further after his crisis speech. The Republican response. The initial Republican response to the crisis was similar to the rest of the nation. However, they became even more determined to replace Carter with someone from the Republican Party. Reagan was a great consideration due to his previous successes as governor of California. Reagan had many criticisms for the Carter administration that were also shared with the Republican Party at large. Reagan ran his first campaign announcement in 1980 and made a few remarks about the state of the nation and the administration that ran it at the time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ronald Reagan.
Good evening. I'm here tonight to announce my intention to seek the Republican nomination for President of the United States. I'm sure that each of us has seen our country from a number of viewpoints, depending on where we've lived and what we've done. For me, it's been as a boy growing up in several small towns in Illinois, as a young man in Iowa trying to get a start in the years of the Great Depression, and later in California for most of my adult life. I've seen America from the stadium press box as a sportscaster, as an actor, officer of my labor union, soldier, office holder, and as both Democrat and Republican. I've lived in an America where those who often had too little to eat outnumbered those who had enough. There have been 4 wars in my lifetime, and I've seen our country face financial ruin in the Depression. I've also seen the great strength of this nation as it pulled itself up from that ruin to become the dominant force in the world. To me, our country is a living, breathing presence, unimpressed by what others say is impossible, proud of its own success, generous, yes, and naive, sometimes wrong, never mean, and always impatient to provide a better life for its people in a framework of a basic fairness and freedom. You know, someone once said that the difference between an American and any other kind of person is that an American lives in anticipation of the future because he knows it'll be a great place. Other people fear the future as just a repetition of past failures. Well, there's a lot of truth in that. If there's one thing we're sure of, it is that history need not be relived, that nothing is impossible, and that man is capable of improving his circumstances beyond what we're told is fact. Now, there are those in our land today, however, who would have us believe that the United States, like other great civilizations of the past, has reached the zenith of its power, that we're weak and fearful, reduced to bickering with each other, and no longer possessed of the will to cope with our problems. Much of this talk has come from leaders who claim that our problems are too difficult to handle. We're supposed to meekly accept their failures as the most which can humanly be done. They tell us we must learn to live with less and teach our children that their lives will be less full and prosperous than ours have been, that the America of the coming years will be a place where, because of our past excesses, it will be impossible to dream and make those dreams come true. I don't believe that, and I don't believe you do either. That's why I'm seeking the presidency.
He remarked how the double-digit inflation was not what the American people wanted, how the country needed to be respected nationally and internationally, and how he had a concise plan to remedy many more issues. The same criticisms of Carter shared by President Ford were also evident in Reagan. During the second Ford and Carter presidential debates, Ford mentions the vagueness of Carter's plans, how the military defense of our nation would be weakened, and how Carter often contradicts himself during his speeches and retorts.
First of all, I would quit conducting the decision-making process in secret. as has been a characteristic of Mr. Kissinger and Mr. Ford. In many instances, we've made agreements, like in Vietnam, that have been revealed later on to our embarrassment. Recently, Ian Smith, the president of Rhodesia, announced that he had unequivocal commitments from Mr. Kissinger that he could not reveal. The American people don't know what those commitments are. We've seen in the past the destruction of elected governments like in Chile and the strong support of military dictatorship there. These kinds of things have hurt us very much. I would restore the concept of the fireside chat, which was an integral part of the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. And I would also restore the involvement of the Congress. When Harry Truman was president, he was not afraid to have a strong Secretary of Defense. Dean Acheson, George Marshall were strong secretaries of state. But he also made sure that there was a bipartisan support. The members of Congress, Arthur Vandenberg, Walter George, were part of the process. And before our nation made a secret agreement, or before we made a bluffing statement, we were sure that we had the backing, not only of the President and the Secretary of State, but also of the Congress and the people. This is a responsibility of the President. And I think it's very damaging to our country for Mr. Ford to have turned over this responsibility to the Secretary of State.
President Ford, do you have a response?
Governor Carter again contradicts himself. He complains about secrecy, and yet he is quoted as saying that in the attempt to find a solution in the Middle East, that he would hold unpublicized meetings with the Soviet Union, I presume for the purpose of imposing a settlement on Israel and the Arab nations.
However, unlike Ford, Reagan was given a platform for criticism after the Carter presidency, so there was a plethora of things to uniquely remark upon. Reagan's campaign announcement saw him address the general idea of what his campaign would look like, but he also addressed Carter's crisis speech. He mentions that the people who earned their money shouldn't feel ashamed for having it, and that the American people saw the next 5 years under Carter to be worse than the previous 5 years. This can be further proved in the approval rating Carter held towards the end of his presidency, and the high approval rating Reagan boasted during his first years in office. Reagan also humbly acknowledged this fact in his presidential acceptance speech, mentioning how the reason the people voted this way was to avoid 4 more years of Carter, and we'll go ahead and play that too.
Can anyone look at the record of this administration and say, well done? Can anyone compare the state of our economy when the Carter administration took office with where we are today and say, keep up the good work? Can anyone look at our reduced standing in the world today and say, let's have 4 more years of this? I believe the American people are going to answer these questions as you've answered them in the first week in November, and their answer will be, no, we've had enough. Thanks to the economic policies of the Democratic Party, millions of Americans find themselves out of work. Millions more have never even had a fair chance to learn new skills, hold a decent job, or secure for themselves and their families a share in the prosperity of this nation. It's time to put America back to work, to make our cities and towns resound with the confident voices of men and women of all races, nationalities, and faiths, bringing home to their families a paycheck they can cash for honest money. For those without skills, we'll find a way to help them get new skills. For those without job opportunities, we'll stimulate new opportunities, particularly in the inner cities where they live. For those who've abandoned hope, we'll restore hope and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again.
The true crisis for Reagan was the failure of the government. The government was oversized, overspending, and still failing to provide for the American people. Reagan also had a great sense of communicating his plans and viewpoints. During the presidential debate between Carter and Reagan, Reagan addressed cutting down the government spending, how to foster a better relationship with urban policies, and taking on the issues of energy, and we'll play a clip of that.
On cutting government spending in what you have just said about your own policies, you have also said that you would increase defense spending. Specifically, where would you cut government spending if you were to increase defense spending and also cut taxes so that presumably federal revenues would shrink?
Well, most people, when they think about cutting government spending, they think in terms of eliminating necessary programs or wiping out some service that government is supposed to perform. I believe that there is enough extravagance and fat in government. As a matter of fact, one of the secretaries of HEW under Mr. Carter testified that he thought there was $7 billion worth of fraud and waste in welfare and in the medical programs associated with it. We've had the General Accounting Office estimate that there is probably tens of billions of dollars that is lost in fraud alone, and they have added that waste adds even more to that. We have a program for a gradual reduction of government spending based on these theories, and I have a task force now that has been working on where those cuts could be made. I'm confident that it can be done and that it will reduce inflation because I did it in California. And inflation went down below the national average in California when we returned money to the people and reduced government spending.
All of these were communicated to the American people, and he addressed how he could successfully remedy these issues using concise language and facts to back up the goals he had. Reagan showed consistently in his political campaign by making some points about Carter in his presidential debate with John Anderson, the independent nominee of 1980. The criticisms were found agreeable upon the American people then, and even today. A Brookings article further discusses and contrasts the Carter and Reagan presidency. It mentions the failures of the economy, the failure of the government in domestic and international affairs, the lack of confidence within the nation, and the lack of trust with the government. Reagan went on to have an iconic presidency and remained steadfast in his campaign promises. An article by the White House Gov was able to further confirm the success and achievement of Reagan during his time in office, and I'll link that in the description as well. The article even goes on to mention how the nation indeed had a sense of self-confidence by the time re-election came around. This self-confidence within the nation is what allowed Reagan to succeed in a second term as president. In this interview with former President Jimmy Carter in 1986, the former president recalls his presidency and key moments of his term. I'll have that linked below as well. The topics range from debates with the former President Gerald Ford and his moments in office and his experience with Reagan at the end. It's important to note that Carter was saying in his interview the debate and rhetoric between him and Reagan didn't have much effect on the outcome of the race, and that the bad sentiment with Carter's previous actions as president were the reasons why Reagan was able to succeed. Reagan also gave an interview that discussed his opinions of what allowed him to have a successful campaign to presidency, and I'll have that linked too. One of the questions posed were the debates prior to the election. Reagan recalls the cultural climate at the time and informs the interviewer that indeed most of the people saw 4 more years of pessimism with Carter and 4 more years of optimism with Reagan. Conclusion. The disrespect the government was receiving was evident during the Carter administration, yet waned tremendously during the Reagan administration. An article by the National Archives further corroborates the sentiment of national and international respect and self-confidence that radiated from the American people during the Reagan administration. Reagan had a consistent plan for his career as president, and he remained that way during both terms. His concise language, ability to plan and set goals, and his ability to communicate anything he deemed necessary allowed him to sway the people towards his vote, focusing on the facts of optimism and considering that there wasn't much of it during the Carter administration. It is evident that once Reagan took office in 1981, the upward trend remained at a peak while he held office. Below, I will have my entire bibliography for this linked so that you can further check out these sources that I mentioned here. I want to thank you all so much for listening and for sticking around. I know it's been a long time since I've posted. I've been taking a lot of classes, and one of the classes that I took was Reagan's America, and my final research paper for that class was about Carter's crisis of confidence speech and how America took it and how the Republican Party took it and how that had a major influence on how people saw Carter and his way of governing. He didn't seem very confident in himself, and he was telling people that they should feel bad about the wealth that they have and the luxuries he mentioned. And Reagan really detested that, and a lot of people in America did as well. One of the more interesting parts was knowing that MAGA came from Reagan's speech. A lot of the Republican Party and their talking points right now come from Ronald Reagan. Anyways, I thank you so much, like I said, for getting this far into the video. If you are this far into the video, please just comment below letting me know that you got this far. I might post something before Christmas. I also might not, because I'm still in school. You know, finals are coming up. But if not, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, take care, and see you in the next video.
Because of a very high medical bill, then the insurance would help pay for it. These are the kind of elements of a national health insurance important to the American people. Governor Reagan, again, typically is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again.